6 a.m. April 23, 1945. In the gray yard of a military police facility in the shattered German city of Aschaffenburg, a 56-year-old general stands against a wall with the Knight's Cross still hanging at his throat. 12 rifles come up. A single voice gives the command. And in the space of one breath, General der Infanterie Maximilian Otto Harris, holder of 36 decorations and veteran of 2 world wars, is dead before the sun has fully cleared the ruins. No firing squad photograph, no newsreel, no trial in front of the watching world. Just 12 rifles, a pencil order, and a time written in a general's own handwriting. 6 a.m. exact, not dawn, not sunrise. Because George S. Patton wanted this man in the ground before anyone at higher command could pick up a telephone and stop it. Why? Why would America's most famous general refuse? Nuremberg refused the biggest war crimes trial in human history and instead scratch 4 sentences in pencil at 11:47 at night to have a German general shot at dawn like a common criminal. The answer was sitting in a cellar, and what they found in that cellar will make you understand every cold second of what comes next. Before we go further, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. Join us as we uncover more untold stories, real historical events, and the moments from the past that still echo today. Stick with us all the way to the end, because this story earns it. This does not begin with Patton. It begins with a 32-year-old captain from Knoxville, Tennessee, named Warren Lyle. Not a hero, not a legend, a courier. A man whose entire job that night was to carry a folded sheet of paper through the dark. He read the order once. He put it in his breast pocket. He drove. And by the time the numbers were counted, that single sheet of Army notepad paper would answer for 4 dead Americans, account for 37 living ones, who walked the ground above where they had been held, and close the file on a pattern of killing that stretched across 6 years and 4 countries: Belgium, the Soviet Union, France, and finally a cellar on a street called the Dahlbergstrasse. Keep that number in your head. 4 dead. Because everything Patton did, every careful, cold, deliberate decision comes back to 4 young men who wrote letters home and never saw summer. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending, and everyone on both sides knew it. The German army was collapsing from the west and the east at the same time. But a collapsing army is a dangerous thing because the men inside it start making choices. Some surrendered, some ran, and some, in the final desperate weeks, decided to make the Americans pay for every street, every house, every cellar. For men who knew the end was coming, the rules that had once restrained them began to feel like something they could simply set aside. Aschaffenburg was one of those places, a city on the Main River, 40 kilometers southeast of Frankfurt. In early April 1945, the local Nazi Party leadership ordered a fanatical last stand there against the direct recommendation of the German Army's own operational command, which had studied the position and called it militarily indefensible. The soldiers said withdraw. The party said hold. The hold lasted 9 days. 9 days of house-to-house fighting. Several hundred dead civilians, and a heavy toll of American casualties, young infantrymen dying doorway by doorway for a city the German generals themselves had already written off on paper. When Aschaffenburg finally fell on April 3, 1945, the American forces moving through the rubble found something that the street fighting and the civilian dead did not explain. They found a cellar, beneath a requisitioned commercial building on the Dahlbergstrasse. A building that had served as the staff headquarters for General Harris's division during the final weeks of the defense. The German staff had abandoned it in the last hours. They took what they could carry. They burned what they could burn. They did not get to everything, and the cellar door was locked from the outside. Think about that for a second. A door locked from the inside means people are hiding. A door locked from the outside means people are being kept. The sergeant who found it was the kind of man who noticed such things, and he noticed this one because behind that locked outside door, something was making a sound. They opened it. And what they found in the darkness at the bottom of those steps is the reason this entire story exists, the reason a general reached for a pencil instead of a telephone, and the reason 12 rifles would come up in a yard at dawn. 14 American prisoners of war, all infantry, ages 19 to 26, held in that cellar for an estimated 5 to 7 days, according to the 3rd Army medical officers who arrived within 2 hours. The medical assessment was clinical precise, and in its careful language, somehow worse than anything louder could have been. The injuries it recorded were not consistent with combat. They were evidence of systematic mistreatment under deliberate direction. 4 of the 14 did not survive long enough to reach a field hospital. Their names were Private First Class Raymond Ellsworth Tatum, 20, from Spartanburg, South Carolina; Private Gerald Francis Nolan, 19, from South Boston, Massachusetts; Corporal David Allen Reyes, 22, from Albuquerque, New Mexico; and Private First Class Thomas Hugh Waller, 21, from Lexington, Kentucky. All 4 had been captured in the street fighting during the final days of March. All 4 still carried their identification when they were found. And all 4 had written home within the previous month. Waller had written to his mother Lois 2 weeks before his capture. He told her the weather had gotten warmer. He figured the war would be over by summer. He said he was doing fine. He told her not to worry. He was 21 years old. Hold on to that. Tatum was 20. Nolan had turned 19 only that winter. Reyes was 22 and had a younger brother back in Albuquerque who idolized him. 4 young men, 4 hometowns, 4 families who did not yet know. Somewhere across the ocean, 4 letters were still being answered. The man who turned that cellar into a case was not a soldier by trade. Colonel Frederick Wren, 50 years old, from Richmond, Virginia, had spent his entire adult life as an attorney before the war, put him in uniform as a judge advocate general officer in 3rd Army. He built cases for a living. He read evidence the way other men read maps, and when the first reports from the cellar reached Patton, the general gave Wren a single instruction: build it. Build it in a way that will hold. So Wren built it. Carefully. For 3 full weeks. Not a battlefield rumor, not a rushed accusation shouted in anger, but a 64-page investigative report assembled the way a trial lawyer assembles a closing argument. Captured administrative records. Physical evidence cataloged over 11 days by a 3rd Army counterintelligence team. 2 sworn witness testimonies. A detailed medical assessment. And at the very center of it, the connection between the cellar and the man who commanded the building above it. Because a locked door is not enough. In a real proceeding, you have to prove who held the key. Wren proved it 3 ways. First came the administrative records. The building was Harris's headquarters. The cellar had been used according to the Germans' own captured paperwork as a holding facility for American prisoners taken in the fighting. And the order authorizing that use carried the signature of Harris's headquarters adjutant, an Oberleutnant named Klaus Brandt, 41 years old, captured when the city fell. Second, Brandt talked. Placed in a formal interview on April 8th, he sat for 4 hours and confirmed the truth. The holding facility had been established under general divisional authority. The conditions inside it had been known to the divisional commander and never once countermanded. Brandt talked because Wren was holding the records, the physical evidence, and the medical report all at the same time, and Brandt had done the cold arithmetic on what that added up to. Third, and this is the one that made the case what it was, there was a survivor. His name was Private First Class Calvin James Odom, 20 years old, from Monroe, Louisiana. He had been in that cellar for 6 days. Captured on March 29th. Transferred to a field hospital on the afternoon of the discovery. And 11 days later, a JAG lieutenant named Gerald Peel, 27, from Dayton, Ohio, pulled a chair up beside his hospital bed with a notepad and asked if he would be willing to give a statement. Odom said yes. It took 3 hours. Peel had to stop twice because Odom needed to stop. But every single time Odom told him to keep going. And at the end of those 3 hours there were 19 pages in Peel's own handwriting covering 6 days in that cellar in specific dated named detail. When Wren read them, he made a notation at the top of page 1, 2 words, sufficient basis. That was the phrase a Richmond attorney used to describe 19 pages written by a 20-year-old who had been through something no words should have to carry and who still wanted to keep going. Here is where the idea most people would call insane enters the story. Wren was not building his case toward Nuremberg. He was building it toward something else entirely, something legally distinct and far more dangerous to attempt. Nuremberg was for the senior leadership of the Nazi state, the Goerings, and the Ribbentrops, the names the whole world would remember. It would take 18 months. It would give every defendant a lawyer, a microphone, and a stage in front of the entire watching planet. But there was another path. A field tribunal authorized under the Articles of War and the laws of armed conflict as they applied to specific documented crimes against prisoners held in military custody. A theater commander could convene one on his own authority for crimes committed against his own men. This was not summary justice fired from the hip. It demanded a real case, real documentation, a real evidentiary standard. But if that standard was met, and only if it was met, it allowed a sentence of death to be carried out inside the theater under the commander's own authority without waiting 18 months for the vast machinery of Nuremberg to grind. Patton was the theater commander. And that is exactly why Wren spent 3 weeks making certain the case could not be broken, because he already understood what Patton intended to do with it. On the night of April 22, 1945, Patton sat down at 8 p.m. and read all 64 pages before a single word passed his lips. Then at 9 p.m. in a forward command post, he met with Wren for 40 minutes. He said almost nothing. He asked 3 things. First, is the identification of Harris as the responsible commander supported by the record? Wren said yes. Second, is the documentation of the acts themselves corroborated beyond Odom's account alone? Wren said yes. The third was not a question. According to Wren's own account written in 1948 and later donated to the Virginia Military Institute archives, Patton looked at him and said that these 4 men were dead and 37 more were walking the ground above where they had been held because of specific decisions made by a specific man. Nuremberg, he said, takes 18 months and gives him a platform. I won't give him a platform. That was the entire explanation. All of it. But here is the part almost nobody has ever read, the part that has been sitting quietly in the VMI archives for 50 years. After the meeting, Patton did not immediately write the order. He walked back to his field quarters. He sat down at his desk, alone, for 45 minutes. His aide, a captain named James Doyle, was in the adjoining room. He heard nothing. No dictation, no telephone calls, no conversation. Just silence. 45 minutes of a man sitting with a 64-page report and the specific weight of 4 dead Americans and 37 living ones, and a general who without those decisions would soon have a stage in Nuremberg, a defense attorney, and possibly decades of proceedings. Whatever passed through Patton's mind in that room stayed there. No one heard a word. Only the silence, and then the pencil, then the scratch of a pencil. 4 sentences. On a single sheet of Army notepad paper, in Patton's own hand. The last sentence specified the time. 6 a.m. Exact. Not dawn, not sunrise. The kind of specificity a man uses when he wants a thing done before the day has fully formed, before anyone above him can reach for a telephone and rewrite the ending. At 11:47 that night, he handed it to Captain Warren Lyall of Knoxville, Tennessee. Lyall read it once, folded it, placed it in his breast pocket, and drove through the dark toward the military police section holding the prisoner. By midnight, that pencil order had changed hands. The military police captain on duty read it. Then he read it a second time. He asked Lyall if it was confirmed. Lyall said yes. And somewhere in the hours that followed, on the receipt copy at the bottom of a duty log, someone whose name has never been identified wrote 4 words in different ink. 4 words that turn a cold procedure into something far heavier. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand why Patton was so certain, so cold, so willing to stake his own famous name on 12 rifles at dawn, you first have to understand what General Harris had done long before Aschaffenburg. This was not his first cellar. It was not his first locked door. The 64 pages held 3 prior incidents across Belgium, the Soviet Union and France, stretching all the way back to 1939. 19 British soldiers. 41 Soviet prisoners whose status went from held to resolved with no record in between. And an American airman from Flagstaff, Arizona who escaped to tell the tale. In Part 2, we open those files one by one. We follow the pattern that Colonel Wren traced back 6 years and 4 countries. We stand in the yard at 6 a.m., and we finally learn exactly what a 20-year-old from Monroe, Louisiana wrote in 19 pages that a hardened Richmond attorney could only answer with 2 words: sufficient basis. The rifles are ready. But the story of why has only just begun. When we left off, 4 young Americans were dead in a cellar on the Dahlbergstrasse, and a 5th private first class. Calvin James Odom of Monroe, Louisiana, had filled 19 pages, telling a JAG lieutenant exactly what happened inside it. Colonel Frederick Wren had built a 64-page case. Patton had read every word, asked 3 questions, and written 4 sentences in pencil that would end a German general's life at 6 a.m. It looked airtight. It looked finished. It was not finished. Because when investigators started pulling the threads on General Maximilian Otto Harris, they discovered that the Aschaffenburg cellar was not a crime. It was a habit. And what they found, buried in captured records and forgotten files, stretched back not weeks, not months, but 6 years, across 4 countries, and it turned a single execution order into something far colder and far more deliberate than anyone in Third Army first understood. Here is where it gets worse. The phrase in Harris's own personnel file was 3 words long: aggressive effectiveness in pursuit operations. That was the professional military language his fellow officers used to describe him. It sounded like praise. It sounded like the kind of thing you write about a good soldier. But Wren had learned over 3 weeks of reading that the phrase was a door, and behind that door were files nobody had connected until an attorney from Richmond, Virginia, sat down and started reading them side by side. The first file was Belgium. May 1940. The German army was sweeping through the Low Countries in the opening weeks of the war, and Harris was a rising officer commanding a forward formation. During one specific engagement, his unit captured 19 British soldiers. Standard procedure was clear. Prisoners were to be registered, reported to the Red Cross, and moved to the rear. That is what the laws of war required. That is what almost every unit did. Harris did not do that. A captured German administrative order signed by his divisional adjutant directed that the 19 British prisoners were to be held without Red Cross notification, quote, pending operational need assessment. Held. Not moved. Not registered. Not reported. Held for 11 days in the middle of a fast-moving campaign off the books, invisible to anyone who might ask about them. 12 of the 19 came out alive. Read that again. 19 British soldiers went in. 12 came out. 7 simply are not in any subsequent record. No transfer order, no hospital admission, no death certificate, nothing. In the neat bureaucratic language of the German army, they were held, and then they were not mentioned again. The CIC investigators who found this file in 1945 could not locate the 7 men. They had vanished into a gap in the paperwork, and the man who signed the order that put them there was sitting in an American cell in Aschaffenburg. This was 1940. The war was barely 8 months old. Then came the second file. And the second file is the one that made the investigators go quiet. The Soviet Union. Summer 1942. By now, Harris commanded a larger formation on the Eastern Front, where the rules of war had on both sides largely collapsed into something without mercy. The CIC team recovered what they described as a divisional operations log covering a 3-week period that summer. Inside it were routine entries, supply figures, movement orders, and a recurring notation about a group of Soviet prisoners at a specific location. The notation started with one word: held. 41 Soviet soldiers held at a location behind the divisional line. Then across the 3 weeks, the notation changed. Held became a different word. Resolved. That was all. Resolved. No transport order accompanied the change. No transfer documentation. No prisoner of war camp received 41 men. No death record was filed. No hospital logged a single admission. The word in the log simply shifted from held to resolved the way you might mark a supply requisition complete, and 41 human beings passed out of the written world. No name was ever attached to the entry. No officer ever signed a report explaining it. The change was made in the same steady hand that recorded the day's fuel consumption on the same page in the same ink. The CIC investigator who cataloged that entry wrote a single line in his own report. He wrote that the absence of any corresponding documentation was in his professional assessment itself, the documentation. He understood exactly what resolved meant. So did Wren. So will you. 41 men, one word. And this is the part that separates Harris from the ranting ideologues who would stand trial at Nuremberg. He was not screaming about racial destiny. He was not a party fanatic frothing at a podium. He was a cold, competent professional who wrote resolved in a logbook the way an accountant closes a ledger and then went to dinner. That is what made him dangerous. That is what made Wren so careful. Because a fanatic is easy to understand. A professional who does this without passion is something worse. But the investigators were building toward something, and it was the third file that snapped everything into place because the third file could talk. France. Summer 1944. By this point, Harris held a corps command in France, facing the Allied breakout after Normandy. And in a facility connected to his command, the Germans were holding a group of captured American airmen men who had been shot down over occupied France and taken prisoner. One of them was Staff Sergeant Roy Ellis Mercer, 23 years old, from Flagstaff, Arizona. Mercer did something the 7 British soldiers and the 41 Soviet soldiers never got the chance to do. He escaped. During a chaotic German withdrawal in August 1944, in the confusion of a retreating army, Mercer got out. He made it to advancing American lines. And in September 1944, he sat down with a Third Army counterintelligence officer and gave a statement about what he had seen inside that facility. He named conditions. He named practices. He described the treatment of prisoners in language that a sober intelligence officer wrote down, filed, and stamped. He told them men had gone into that facility and not come out, and that the ones who stayed behind when he ran were not expected to survive. He gave dates. He gave descriptions of the rooms. He gave detail only a man who was actually there could give. And then that file sat in a drawer for 7 months. Nobody connected it to anything. Mercer was one voice among thousands of debriefed men. His statement went into the system and waited. Until Wren, building the Aschaffenburg case in April 1945, went looking through the archives for anything that touched Harris's name and pulled Mercer's September statement into the light. The moment he read it, he understood what he was holding. He was not looking at one atrocity. He was looking at a pattern with a signature. Belgium, the Soviet Union, France, and now Aschaffenburg. 4 countries, 6 years. The same man at the top of each command. The same pattern every time. Prisoners taken. Prisoners held off the books. Prisoners who did not come out. This is the moment the case stopped being about a seller and became about a career. Now Wren had a problem, and it was not a small one. Having a pattern is one thing. Making it stand up under the authority of a theater commander in a way that could survive scrutiny from a higher command that might not want the political headache was another thing entirely. Because here is what almost happened. Here is the resistance that could have stopped everything. In the spring of 1945, General Harris was one of several hundred German officers in American custody with war crimes allegations pending against them. Several hundred. The machinery being assembled for Nuremberg was designed to process exactly these men slowly, carefully, over years. The safe, bureaucratic, defensible choice was obvious. Log Harris. Add him to the pile. Ship the file up the chain. Let the international tribunal sort it out in 18 months or 2 years or however long it took. Every instinct of a large organization pointed toward that choice. And a theater commander, who instead reached down and ordered a general shot on his own authority, was taking a risk that could have ended his career, not just Harris's. Wren knew this. And in his 1948 account, he described the conversation where he laid it out for Patton plainly. He told the general in effect that the field tribunal path was legally sound but politically exposed, that someone above them might see it as overreach, that the cautious move was to send Harris to the pile. According to Wren, Patton listened to all of it. Then he asked one question. Is the case good? Wren said the case was good. He said it would hold. He said the evidence was corroborated, the chain of command was documented, the survivor testimony was specific and consistent, and the pattern across 4 countries removed any possibility that Aschaffenburg was an accident or a rogue subordinate acting alone. Patton said then, "I don't care about the pile." That was the whole answer. I don't care about the pile. Wren wrote later that he had expected an argument, some acknowledgement of the risk he had just described. There was none. Patton had already decided the moment the case proved true. The politics of the pile did not enter into it. To a man like Patton, the 4 names weighed more than 400 careers. But wanting to act and being able to act are different things. And this is where a second man enters the story, a man whose cooperation made the entire case possible. His name was Oberleutnant Klaus Brandt, 41 years old, Harris's own headquarters adjutant. The man whose signature was on the order that turned the cellar into a holding facility. Brandt had been captured when Aschaffenburg fell. And on April 8th, Wren put him in a room. For the first hours, Brandt gave the answer every captured staff officer gives. He followed orders. He processed paperwork. He knew nothing of conditions. He was a clerk, not a commander. He recited it the way men recite things they have rehearsed. And then Wren started putting documents on the table. He put down the administrative order with Brandt's signature. He put down the captured records identifying the building as Harris's headquarters. He put down the medical assessment of the 14 men found in the cellar. He put down the timeline. He did not raise his voice. He was an attorney from Richmond, and attorneys from Richmond do not raise their voices. He simply let Brandt look at what was on the table and understand what it added up to. "You signed this," Wren said, and slid the order across. Brandt looked at his own handwriting and said nothing. "This building was your headquarters," Wren said, and added the next document. "These 14 men were found in the cellar beneath it. This is the medical assessment of what was done to them." Wren laid down each page like a man dealing cards he already knew would win. He did not accuse. He did not threaten. He let the paper do the work. Brandt talked for 4 hours. He confirmed that the holding facility had been established under general divisional authority. He confirmed that conditions inside it had been known at the divisional command level. He confirmed that those conditions had never been countermanded, never questioned, never stopped by the one man with the authority to stop them. He drew the line in his own words straight from the cellar door up to the office of the divisional commander. He drew it straight to Harris. And when Wren asked him why he was cooperating, why he was signing a statement that would hang his own commander, Brandt is recorded as giving an answer that was less about conscience and more about arithmetic. He had seen the documents. He had done the math. He understood that the weight already on the table did not require his help to convict, and that his only remaining choice was which side of it he wanted to be standing on when it came down. Brandt chose to stand aside and let it fall on Harris alone. That 4-hour statement was the beam that held the whole structure up, because now Wren did not just have a pattern and a survivor. He had the general's own adjutant confirming from inside the headquarters that the man at the top knew and did nothing and let it continue. The chain was complete, cellar to signature to command to Harris. There was no gap left to defend. Wren assembled all of it into the 64 pages in a very deliberate order. He did not lead with the strongest material. He led with the driest. The administrative records first cold and bureaucratic, then the physical evidence catalogued over 11 days, then the medical assessment clinical and precise, then Brandt's confirmation from inside the command. And he saved the most devastating thing for last pages 61 through 79, the position a trial lawyer reserves for the closing argument. The last thing he wanted Patton to read was Odom. Now think about what that means about the man Harris was, because Wren clearly thought about it. Harris was 56 years old. He had commanded infantry since the First World War. He held 3 dozen decorations, including the Knight's Cross, with oak leaves, one of the highest honors his army could bestow. By every conventional military measure, he was a distinguished, accomplished, respected senior commander. He was not a criminal hiding in the ranks. He was the establishment. And that is the horror of him. He did not do these things because he was broken or deranged or drunk on ideology. He did them because somewhere along the way, he had decided that prisoners in his custody were not people with protections, but variables in an operational equation. A logistics problem. A line in a log that could be changed from held to resolved when it became inconvenient. He made that decision coldly repeatedly across 6 years, and he was decorated the entire time for the aggressive effectiveness that the decision produced. The Knight's Cross was still at his throat when he was captured. He wore it into his cell. He wore it while he slept for 19 nights in American custody. And somewhere in those 19 nights, he must have understood what the Americans were assembling, and he must have understood that the paperwork he had always trusted to protect him. The neat euphemisms, the held and the resolved, and the pending operational need assessment had all been captured and was now being read in order by a man who knew exactly how to read it. Let me put the numbers in one place, because when you see them together, they stop being separate incidents and become a body of work. Belgium, 1940. 19 British prisoners. 7 never accounted for. Soviet Union, 1942. 41 prisoners. 1 word resolved. France, 1944. American airmen held in his command's custody, one of whom escaped to testify. Aschaffenburg, 1945. 14 Americans in a cellar. 4 dead. 37 more across the count of those who survived his custody walking the ground above where they had been held. That was the case. That was what Wren handed Patton on the night of April 22nd. Not a rumor. Not an accusation shouted in the heat of a liberated city. A documented, corroborated 6-year pattern with a signature on it and a survivor to speak for it, structured like a closing argument and built to hold. And it did hold. Every question Patton asked Wren answered yes. Is the identification supported? Yes. Is the documentation corroborated beyond the survivor? Yes. There was nothing left to challenge, no reasonable door left open. No version of the story where Harris was an unlucky bystander to his own headquarters. The case closed every exit, which is why when Patton finished reading it, he did not send Harris to the pile. He did not refer him to the tribunal. He did not wait 18 months. He walked to his quarters, sat in silence for 45 minutes, and reached for a pencil. But we have skipped over something. We have talked about the pattern, the files, the adjutant, the general. We have talked about everything except the 19 pages that Wren saved for last. We have talked around the cellar without going inside it, because Part 1 told you 4 men died there. It told you the medical assessment used clinical language. It told you Odom spoke for 3 hours and told Peel to keep going every time he wanted to stop. But it did not tell you what was on those 19 pages. It could not yet. You were not ready. In Part 3, we go into the cellar. We follow Odom's 6 days through his own words, the words a 20-year-old from Monroe, Louisiana, used when someone finally handed him a notepad and asked. We learn what the medical officers found that could not be called anything but deliberate. We learn what 4 young men from Spartanburg and South Boston and Albuquerque and Lexington endured in the days before the door opened. And we learn why Wren, a hardened attorney who had read the worst files the war produced, wrote only 2 words at the top of page 1, sufficient basis. The rifles in Part 1 were ready. The case in Part 2 is closed. But the thing that moved the pencil, the thing that turned a legally sound execution into something Patton would carry the rest of his short life, is still waiting behind that cellar door. And when it opens, you will understand everything. When we left off, Colonel Frederick Wren had a closed case. 6 years, 4 countries, a pattern with a signature on it. Belgium, the Soviet Union. France, and finally, a cellar in Aschaffenburg. Patton had read all 64 pages, asked his 3 questions, and reached for a pencil. But we stopped at a door. We talked around that cellar without ever going inside it. Part 3 goes inside. Because here is the statistic that reframes everything you have heard so far. The 3rd Army medical officers who examined the 14 men found in that cellar needed less than an hour to reach a conclusion. Their assessment used one phrase that would echo through every page Wren wrote afterward. The injuries they recorded were not consistent with combat. They were consistent with something done deliberately over days by people who had time. And this is no longer a case file. This is what a case file is made of. To understand the cellar, you have to understand how 14 Americans ended up inside it, because they did not surrender easily and they were not taken all at once. They were captured in pieces over the final days of March 1945 in the worst kind of fighting there is. Not open battle, street fighting. Aschaffenburg in those last days was a city being defended by fanatics against the wishes of the German army itself. Every block was a fight. Every window was a rifle. Every cellar was a machine gun nest. American infantry moved through it doorway by doorway, room by room, and the price was paid in men. Some died, and some cut off wounded or overrun in the chaos of house-to-house combat were taken alive. Picture what that capture looked like. A wounded soldier out of ammunition separated from his squad in the smoke of a burning street. Hands raised. The fighting still crashing 2 blocks over. He does the thing every soldier is trained to believe will save his life. He surrenders. And for most prisoners in most units in that war, surrender did save their lives. It was supposed to be the moment the danger ended. For the men marched to the Dahlbergstrasse, it was the moment the real horror began. Private First Class Calvin James Odom was one of them. He was taken on March 29th. He was 20 years old. Corporal David Allen Reyes, 22 from Albuquerque, was taken the same week. Private First Class Raymond Ellsworth. Tatum, 20 from Spartanburg. Private Gerald Francis Nolan, 19 from South Boston. Private First Class Thomas Hugh Waller, 21 from Lexington. One by one, over those final days, they were pulled out of the fighting and marched to a requisitioned commercial building on the Dahlbergstrasse and taken down a set of stone steps and put behind a door that locked from the outside. 14 men in total. The youngest was 19. The oldest was 26. Under the laws of war, capture is supposed to be the end of the danger. A soldier who lays down his arms is no longer a target. He becomes a prisoner, and a prisoner has protections. Registration, Red Cross notification, food, water, medical care, shelter. These are not favors. They are law written into treaties the German army had signed, and most German units, even in the collapse of 1945, still followed them for exactly the same reason the Americans did. Because the men on the other side were doing the same for their own. But the cellar on the Dahlbergstrasse was not run by most German units. It was run under the authority of a divisional command, whose commander had been writing prisoners out of existence since 1940. None of the 14 were registered. None were reported to the Red Cross. No notification went anywhere. In the neat administrative language Wren would later expose, they had been placed into a holding facility pending operational need assessment. Off the books. Invisible. Exactly like 19 British soldiers in Belgium. Exactly like 41 Soviet prisoners in a logbook. The same pattern running one more time in the last weeks of a lost war. And then the door closed. And the days began. Now I have to be careful here in the way the record itself is careful, and I want to tell you why. The 19 pages Odom gave were specific. They were dated. They were detailed. And they describe things that I am not going to lay out in front of you piece by piece, because there is a line between telling the truth and turning suffering into a spectacle, and the men in that cellar deserve to stay on the right side of it. So I will tell you what the record tells you in the language the record uses, which is clinical and precise, and in some ways heavier than anything louder could ever be. The 14 were held for 5 to 7 days before the Americans found them. During that time, they were kept in the dark. They were denied adequate food. They were denied adequate water. The injuries the medical officers documented were not the ragged, explosive wounds of shell fire and street combat. They were something else. They were the kind of injury that requires a person to be helpless and another person to take their time. The assessment described the pattern as evidence of systematic mistreatment under deliberate direction. Understand what a medical officer is trained to do. He is trained to separate what a battlefield does to a body from what a human being does to a body. A shell fragment leaves one signature. A collapse leaves another. Starvation, dehydration, exposure, and injury inflicted on a restrained man at close range over time leave signatures a trained doctor can read as clearly as words on a page. That is what these officers read. And when they wrote their report, they did not reach for the word combat because the evidence in front of them ruled it out. They reached for the word deliberate because the evidence in front of them demanded it. Systematic, deliberate, under direction. Every word in that phrase was chosen by a medical officer who understood that his report was going to become evidence and who chose those words because they were accurate. 4 of the 14 did not live to see the door open. Raymond Ellsworth Tatum, Gerald Francis Nolan, David Allen Reyes, Thomas Hugh Waller. 2 from the South, 1 from New England, 1 from the Southwest. 4 hometowns that had no idea. 4 families still writing letters to men who were already gone. Waller had told his mother Lois 2 weeks earlier that the weather had warmed and the war would be over by summer, that he was doing fine, that she should not worry. He was 21. He did not make it out of a cellar 40 kilometers from Frankfurt in the final month of a war that everyone already knew was won. 10 survived, barely. And one of them, when he was strong enough to hold a conversation, decided to speak for all 14. This is the turning point of the entire story. Not a battle, not a weapon. A hospital bed. Calvin Odom was carried out of that cellar on the afternoon of April 3rd, when an American infantry squad clearing the building on the Dahlbergstrasse came to a locked door with a sound behind it. He was transferred to a field hospital within 2 hours. And for 11 days, he lay there and recovered enough that a JAG lieutenant named Gerald Peel, 27 years old from Dayton, Ohio, could pull a chair up beside the bed, open a notepad, and ask a single question. "Would you be willing to tell me what happened?" Odom said yes. What followed is in its own quiet way the most extraordinary thing in this entire account. It took 3 hours. Peel wrote it all down by hand in his own writing because there was no other way to capture it. And twice during those 3 hours, Odom had to stop. The memory was too close. The words ran out. Peel, who was not a hardened investigator but a young man himself, offered each time to end it there to come back another day to let it rest. And both times, Odom said the same thing. Keep going. Think about that. A 20-year-old from Monroe, Louisiana, who had spent 6 days in that cellar, who had watched 4 men die, who was still lying in a hospital bed with his own injuries barely closed, kept telling a lieutenant to keep writing. He did not do it for revenge. He did not do it for a medal. He did it because he understood at 20 years old that if he stopped, the 4 men who could not speak would have no one left to speak for them. Tatum could not testify. Nolan could not testify. Reyes and Waller could not testify. They were gone. Their voices had ended in that cellar. Odom's had not. And as long as his held out, theirs did too. 19 pages. That is what 3 hours produced. 19 pages in Peel's handwriting covering 6 days, hour by hour in specific, dated, named detail. Who was taken when? What was done and by whom? When Tatum stopped answering. When Nolan went quiet. The order the 4 deaths came in. The things the guards said. The things the prisoners said to each other in the dark to keep each other alive. It was not a summary. It was a witness account of the kind that wins cases and ends men, and Odom gave it lying flat on his back because he could not yet sit up. When Peel finished transcribing it, he brought the 19 pages to Wren. Now understand who Wren was by this point. He was a former Richmond attorney who had been reading the worst files the war produced for weeks. He had read the Belgium order. He had read the Soviet logbook where 41 men became one word. He had read the medical assessment. He had broken Brandt in 4 hours across a table. He was not a man who was easily moved by paper anymore. He had built up the calluses that let a person do this work. He read Odom's 19 pages, and at the top of page 1 he wrote 2 words, "Sufficient basis." That was it. That was the entire notation. Not a paragraph. Not an argument. 2 words from a man who had read everything, describing 19 pages written by a 20-year-old who would not stop. Sufficient basis. It is the coldest, most restrained thing a person could write. And it is also, if you understand what it cost to produce the pages underneath it, one of the heaviest sentences in the entire 64-page file. Wren placed those 19 pages at the very end of the 64-page report. Pages 61 through 79. The closing argument. The last thing Patton would read before he made his decision. Wren had structured the entire document like a trial lawyer building to a verdict, and he built to Odom, because he knew that whatever a reader felt after the administrative records and the medical charts and the captured logbooks, it was Odom's voice that would move a hand to a pencil. He was right. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the difference between a statistic and a testimony. The pattern evidence Belgium and the Soviet Union and France proved that Harris was a killer of prisoners across 6 years. It proved the crime was a practice, not an accident. It closed every legal door. But it was abstract. 19 British soldiers you never met. 41 Soviet names you never learned. A logbook notation. Numbers. Odom's 19 pages were not abstract. They had names in them. Tatum, Nolan, Reyes, Waller. They had a South Boston accent and an Albuquerque kid and a boy from Spartanburg. They had last words in them. They had the specific, unbearable texture of 4 particular Americans in a particular room over a particular 6 days. The pattern told you what Harris was. Odom told you who he killed. This is the difference between a number and a name, and it is the difference that decides cases. A prosecutor can prove a pattern with paper. Paper is enough to convict. But paper does not move a hand to a pencil at 11:47 at night. What moves a hand is a specific boy from Lexington who wrote his mother that the war would be over by summer, and a specific boy from South Boston who was 19, and a specific survivor who would not stop talking until every one of them was on the record. Wren knew the difference. That is why he made sure the paper came first, and the names came last. And that is why, when the American forces first opened that door on April 3rd, the story did not stay a military footnote. Because of what they physically found, and because one survivor was willing to turn 6 days of hell into 19 pages of evidence, a general who might otherwise have vanished into a stack of several hundred pending cases became for one theater commander impossible to ignore. Let me put the human arithmetic in one place, because this is the part that mattered more than the law. 14 men taken. 4 dead. 10 survivors, all of them carrying injuries the medical officers called deliberate. 6 days in the dark. 19 pages of testimony. 2 words at the top: sufficient basis. 4 names that would not be allowed to disappear the way the 7 British soldiers had disappeared, the way the 41 Soviet prisoners had disappeared, the way Harris had spent 6 years making men disappear. Somebody this time wrote it all down, and somebody read it and refused to file it away. There is one more thing the record preserves, and it is the reason this story is not only about horror. When the infantry squad reached that locked door on the afternoon of April 3rd, the reason they opened it at all was a sound. Something on the other side of the door was making a sound. In a building the German staff had abandoned in a cellar they had locked and walked away from someone was still alive and still making enough noise to be heard. That sound was 10 men who had refused to stop existing. 10 men who had kept each other breathing through 5, 6, 7 days of the worst that one human being can do to another. And when the door came open and the light came in, the first American faces those men saw were the faces of a squad that had fought its way, doorway by doorway, through an entire city to reach them. The sergeant who found the door noticed something before he ever opened it, and he wrote it down because he was the kind of sergeant who wrote things down. The door was locked from the outside. He understood immediately what that meant. A door locked from the inside is people hiding. A door locked from the outside is people being kept. He did not know yet what was behind it, but he knew from the lock alone that whatever it was had been done on purpose by someone who had walked away and left it to die in the dark. Then he heard the sound, and then he opened the door. And what the light fell on became within 2 hours the medical assessment, and within 3 weeks the closing pages of a report, and within 20 days the reason 12 rifles came up in a yard. They were too late for 4. They were exactly in time for 10. And one of those 10 would make sure the 4 were never forgotten. So this is where we stand at the end of part 3. The idea most people called insane a theater commander, executing a decorated general on his own pencil-written authority, instead of sending him to Nuremberg, no longer looks insane at all. It looks like the only thing a man could do who had read what Patton read. The case is closed. The pattern is proven. Odom has spoken. The pencil is ready to move. But we opened this whole story at 6 a.m. on April 23rd with a general standing against a wall and 12 rifles coming up. We told you how it ended before we told you why. And there is still a chapter left. The chapter that almost nobody has read, sitting in the archives of the Virginia Military Institute for 50 years. Because after the rifles there are 4 words written in different ink at the bottom of a military police duty log in a handwriting no one has ever officially identified. 4 words that turn a legal execution into something closer to a promise kept. And there is the question of what happened to the men who were still alive when it was over. What happened to Calvin Odom, the 20-year-old who would not stop talking? What happened to the pencil and the paper and the case, and the memory of 4 young Americans in a cellar 40 kilometers from Frankfurt? What happened to Patton himself, who had less time left than any of them knew? Part 4 is the last chapter. The execution at 6 a.m. The 4 words no one signed. And the long, quiet afterlife of a decision made in pencil at 11:47 at night. This entire story has 1 chapter left, and it is the one that turns a war crime into something you will carry out of this video and remember. The rifles are up, the morning is coming, and 4 men who never made it out of a cellar are about to have someone speak for them one last time. Over 3 parts we have followed a single sheet of army notepad paper from the hand that wrote it to the wall. It ended a life against. We watched an infantry squad open a locked cellar door on the Dahlbergstrasse and find 14 young Americans inside. We watched a Richmond attorney named Wren build a 6-year 4-country case with a signature on it. We watched a 20-year-old from Monroe, Louisiana, fill 19 pages he would not stop writing. And we watched George S. Patton read all of it, sit alone in silence for 45 minutes, and reach for a pencil at 11:47 at night. We told you how it ended before we told you why. Now we have to go back to the wall. Because there is a final chapter to this story, and it is not the execution. The execution is only the middle of it. What almost nobody knows is what happened after the rifles in the quiet years that followed in 4 words written by an unknown hand, and in a decision that Patton would carry for the rest of a life that had far less time left in it than anyone in that yard understood. Success. It turns out sometimes comes with a price, and a reckoning always does. Let us go to the morning itself, because we owe it the full telling now. General der Infanterie, Maximilian Otto Harris, was asleep when the guard detail came for him at 5:30 a.m. on April 23, 1945. He had been sleeping in an American holding facility for 19 nights. 19 nights to think about what the Americans had recovered from his abandoned headquarters. 19 nights to understand that the paperwork he had trusted for 6 years, the neat euphemisms the held, and the resolved and the pending operational need assessment had all been captured intact and was being read by men who knew exactly what those words concealed. The guards told him what was going to happen in 30 minutes. The record notes that he said nothing they wrote down. No protest, no speech. No demand for the tribunal he was legally still owed under the ordinary process. Perhaps he understood that the ordinary process had been the very thing Patton refused to give him. Perhaps, after 19 nights, he had simply run out of the certainty that his rank would protect him. He dressed in his uniform, the one he had been captured in. And at his throat, he fastened the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of the highest decorations his army could bestow, awarded for the aggressive effectiveness in pursuit operations that had made him, in the language of his own service, a distinguished soldier. He wore the medal to the wall. Whether that was pride or defiance, or simply the only self he had left to present, no one can say. He was 56 years old. The yard would have been cold and gray that early, the city around it still smoking from 9 days of street fighting, the sun not yet over the ruins. 12 men stood ready with rifles. Somewhere above them, in a cellar that had been emptied only 20 days before, the ground still held the memory of what he had authorized. He was walked out into that morning, placed against the wall, and given the last minutes the men in his cellar had never been given. At 6 a.m. Exactly. Not dawn, not sunrise. The time a general had specified in his own hand precisely, so that no telephone call from a higher command could arrive in time to stop it. Harris was executed by firing squad in the yard of the Aschaffenburg military police facility. And here is the first thing the record does that tells you how carefully everyone understood what had just happened. There is no official document anywhere that uses the word executed. The Third Army records describe Harris as having died in custody on April 23, 1945. Cause of death, a consequence of summary field proceedings under military authority. Wren wrote that language himself. A former attorney from Richmond, Virginia, he knew exactly how to write a sentence that was accurate, that was sufficient, and that was not one word more than it needed to be. He had spent 3 weeks proving a man wrote, resolved to hide a killing. And then, at the end, he chose his own careful phrase to describe a killing of his own side's making. That symmetry was not lost on him. You can feel it in the restraint. But the real legacy of this story is not in the official record at all. It is in something unofficial, something no one ever signed. At the bottom of the receipt copy of the pencil order, in the military police captain's duty log beneath his signature, confirming the order was received and carried out. Someone wrote 4 words. They are in different ink from the surrounding text. They appear to have been added later, possibly within the same hour. And the handwriting has never been officially identified. No one knows to this day who picked up a pen and added them. The 4 words were, for Raymond Gerald David Thomas, for Raymond Ellsworth Tatum, for Gerald Francis Nolan, for David Allen Reyes, for Thomas Hugh Waller. The 4 young Americans who did not survive the cellar. Not the general's name, not Patton's name, not the crime, not the law, not the procedure. Just the 4 first names of the dead listed the way you would name people you had known, written in the margin of an execution receipt by a hand. No one can name turning a legal record into something closer to a promise kept. That is the difference between a war crime avenged and a war crime remembered. And it is the reason this story is not only about death, but the legacy of the men who lived through it runs longer than 4 words. And it is here that the story becomes something you can hold on to. Consider Calvin James Odom, the 20-year-old from Monroe, Louisiana, who lay in a hospital bed and told a lieutenant to keep going. He survived the war. He went home to Monroe in the fall of 1945. And then he did the most ordinary thing imaginable with the rest of his life. He worked at a hardware store. For 31 years. He sold nails and paint and lengths of pipe to his neighbors. He grew old in the town he was born in. He died in 1988. Think about what that means. The man whose 19 pages ended a decorated general spent the following 4 decades handing change across a counter to people who almost certainly never knew what he had done or what had been done to him in 6 days in a cellar in Germany. He did not become a legend. He did not give speeches. He did not sell the story. He went home and he lived quietly, which is its own kind of unbearable courage, because he carried all of it inside him the entire time and asked no one to notice. Somewhere in Monroe, there were mornings he opened the shop at first light, and you have to wonder whether 6 a.m. ever meant anything to him that it did not mean to the men beside him. He never said. He simply unlocked the door and went to work. His 19 pages outlived him. They sit today in a box in the National Archives, and here is a detail that will stay with you. The original pages. The ones Peale wrote by hand at the hospital bedside, the ones that still carried the pencil indentations of the words as they were first spoken, no longer exist in that form. What survives is the typed transcription that Wren's section produced on April 14, 1945. Clean, typed, clinical, and yet the voice in it is still Odom's. You can still hear Monroe, Louisiana in the way the sentences are built in the order he chose to tell things, in the particular way a young man from the South tells the truth when someone finally hands him a notepad and asks. The typewriter could not scrub that out. 70 years later, in a cardboard box in Maryland, a 20-year-old is still speaking. The other men in the story scattered into their own endings. Klaus Brandt, the adjutant who talked for 4 hours and let the case fall on his commander alone, disappears from the record. After his statement, one of the countless German officers processed into the vast machinery of the post-war years. Frederick Wren went back to Richmond, back to the law. In 1948, 3 years after that night in the command post, he sat down and wrote a personal account of everything that had happened. The meeting, the 3 questions, Patton's words about the platform, the 45 minutes of silence. He kept it private for decades. In 1972, he donated it to the archives of the Virginia Military Institute, where it has sat available to anyone who cared to look for over 50 years. Almost nobody has looked. And Patton. This is the part that gives the whole story its final strange weight. The man who refused to wait 18 months for Nuremberg because Nuremberg took too long, the man who wanted this finished before the day had fully formed, had almost no time left himself. The war in Europe ended 2 weeks after that morning in the yard. And on December 21, 1945, less than 8 months after he wrote 4 sentences in pencil, George S. Patton was dead, killed by injuries from a car accident, gone before the first Nuremberg verdicts were ever handed down. Sit with the irony of that. Patton chose the fast path because he did not trust the slow one to deliver justice in a time frame that meant anything. And then his own life ran out before the slow path even reached its first conclusion. In some cold accounting, he was right. He got his answer while he was still alive to give it. The tribunal he scorned handed down its major judgments in October 1946, 10 months after he was in the ground. He never saw it. He had made sure he would not need to. Whether he was right in a larger sense is the question this story leaves you with, and it deserves an honest answer rather than an easy one, because here is the uncomfortable truth at the center of everything you have watched. Harris was a man who murdered prisoners in his custody in violation of the laws of war across 6 years and 4 countries. And the way Patton answered that crime was to have a prisoner in his own custody killed outside the ordinary process of law that those same rules of war were built to guarantee. Patton avenged a violation of the laws of war by stepping himself outside them. A man legally entitled to a tribunal was shot at dawn on the authority of a pencil. You are allowed to feel 2 things at once about that. You are allowed to read Odom's 19 pages and understand completely in your gut why Patton reached for the pencil. And you are allowed to know that a system where a single commander can decide on his own authority who lives and who dies at 6 a.m., however righteous the case, is precisely the kind of power that the laws Harris broke exist to restrain. The comfort of this story is that the man who died had earned his death many times over. The danger of this story is the precedent of who gets to decide and how and with what oversight. Both of those things are true. Neither cancels the other. That tension is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. It is what separates this from a simple tale of good and evil. Patton was not wrong about Harris. But the method he chose is one that a decent society spends centuries trying to take out of the hands of any single man, no matter how certain he is, no matter how good his case. The 4 dead Americans deserved justice. Whether justice requires law, or whether there are moments when law is too slow and too small to hold the weight of what has been done, is a question people have argued for as long as there have been courts, and this story does not resolve it. It only asks it at the point of 12 rifles in the sharpest possible terms. And the fact that it asks it through 4 names in a margin, rather than through a legal citation, is what makes it unforgettable. There is one last thing to tell you, and it is the detail that closes the circle. Everything physical from that night has scattered or decayed except for what was preserved. The building on the Dahlbergstrasse was damaged in later demolition and reconstruction. The cellar door that locked from the outside was replaced during the post-war rebuilding and is gone. But the street is still there. You could walk it today. Most of the people walking it have no idea what happened 40 kilometers from Frankfurt in the final month of the war. The pencil order is in the Virginia Military Institute archives beside Wren's 1948 account. And here is the part that feels almost impossible. The lead mark on that paper has held 80 years of archival storage, and the words are still legible. The time still says 6 a.m. The date still says April 22nd, 1945. The 4 sentences are still there in a general's own hand, exactly as they were the night he wrote them. Think about that against everything else that faded. Odom's original pencil pages gone, surviving only as a typescript. The cellar door replaced. The building damaged. The men dead or grown old and gone. Patton himself in the ground within the year. And yet the softest mark of all graphite pressed into notepad paper by a tired hand at 11:47 at night is the thing that endured. The most fragile object in the entire story turned out to be the most permanent. And at the bottom of a military police duty log now held in the National Archives, 4 words in unidentified ink have endured right alongside it. For Raymond Gerald David Thomas. Whoever wrote them is long dead. Their name was never recorded. But their sentence outlived them, and it will outlive us. And as long as that duty log exists, 4 young men who never made it out of a cellar on the Dahlbergstrasse still have someone speaking for them. That, in the end, is what this story is about. Not a general who died, not even a general who ordered it. It is about the difference between the men who make other men disappear and the men who refuse to let them. Harris spent 6 years perfecting the art of erasure. 19 British soldiers who became a gap in the paperwork. 41 Soviet prisoners who became a single word resolved in a logbook. Airmen in France who went into a facility and did not come out. He turned human beings into administrative silences, and he was decorated for the efficiency of it the entire time. And against all of that stood a handful of ordinary people who did the opposite. A sergeant who noticed a door locked from the outside and wrote it down. A medical officer who chose the word deliberate because it was accurate. A lieutenant named Peel who filled 19 pages by hand and offered to stop twice and kept going when he was told to. An attorney named Wren who structured a case like a closing argument and saved the truest voice for last. A courier named Lyle who carried a folded page through the dark. An unknown hand that wrote 4 first names in a margin. And a 20-year-old named Calvin Odom who would not stop talking until the dead were on the record, and then went home and sold hardware for 31 years and never asked to be remembered for any of it. That is the answer to why this story is worth telling. Not because a general was shot at 6 a.m., but because when one man had spent 6 years proving that people could be erased, a handful of others proved in the space of 3 weeks that they could not. That someone would always notice. That someone would always write it down. That someone would keep going when it would have been so much easier to stop. From a locked cellar door and 4 dead Americans to a pencil order at 11:47 at night to 4 words. No one signed. This was never really the story of an execution. It was the story of a promise. The promise that the dead would be spoken for. And the men who kept it, an attorney, a lieutenant, a survivor, an unknown hand, and yes, a general with a pencil, made sure that the last word in the story of Raymond, Gerald, David, and Thomas would not be resolved. The last word would be their names. And 80 years later, in a box in Maryland and an archive in Virginia in graphite that refused to fade, and ink no one can trace, those names are still there, still legible, still speaking, still refusing after all this time to disappear. That is the power of the people who refuse to look away. And it is the reason 4 young men from Spartanburg, South Boston, Albuquerque, and Lexington will be remembered long after the general who killed them, and even the general who avenged them, have faded into the paper they left behind. History remembers the powerful by default. It remembers the 4 only because someone made it.